The history of the Russian Revolution of 1917 was just one of many workshops that were held at the Socialist Party's annual Socialism event this November 2024, where we gathered to discuss and to learn from the struggles of the past for the struggles of today. And in the time that we had available, there was no way that we could cover every issue. I introduced that workshop, but questions were also asked on, for example, how the peasantry moved towards Bolshevism during the months of revolution, how the Bolsheviks approached the issue of the national question across the Tsarist Empire. Both of those issues are actually covered very well in Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution. In fact, in the first two chapters of Volume 3 of that history, and I refer them to you if those are things that you're particularly interested in. But I had to concentrate on a few key points, and again, this history was indeed the main thing that I drew on for my analysis, which I present to you now. We study the history of the Russian Revolution of 1917, not as academics, but to learn lessons from that struggle for the struggles today. And what I hope to do is to concentrate on 5 key months of 1917: February, April, July, August and October. And even that is going to be packing a lot in. I want to try and give an overview of key events, but above all, to focus on the tactical debates within the Bolshevik Party that guided their course to the overthrow of capitalism. I've produced some quotes that will perhaps prompt discussion. But the first quote that I've used from Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution is a list of the revolutions that even then in the 1930s had failed for a lack of leadership by the time Trotsky was then writing. Many more, sadly, could be had since, because working class history is marked with more defeats than victories. So working out why the Russian Revolution of 1917 succeeded is a vital area of study. How did a country of 150 million people enter 1917 under a Tsarist regime that still hadn't even fully abolished medieval feudalism, yet end it under a Soviet government determined to proceed to construct the socialist order, as Lenin put it? Now, to analyse all the events and twists and turns of 1917 would take a lot longer than we have now, but I want to show that a key factor was the presence of the Bolshevik Party. Both its experienced comrades, its cadres in the workplaces and barracks and villages, and its leaders, who understood what needed to be done at each stage, and, although not without considerable internal party debate, successfully led the working class to power. Because one thing we can still be sure of: the conditions created by capitalism will provoke the working class and poor to struggle. However, history has shown it's not enough just to struggle, but you need to know how to win. You need a revolutionary party, built from the best elements of the working class, a party of active cadres that has learned from the struggles of the past in order to explain and guide our class to victory. But such a party will only succeed if it can gain workers' confidence by correctly gauging their level of consciousness at each stage, and as the Bolsheviks succeeded in doing in 1917, fit its demand to match that consciousness, like Goldilocks, not too far in front, but certainly not too far behind either. Now let's start in February 1917, in Petrograd, Russia's capital city. And that marked the start of the revolution on International Women's Day, March the 8th for us, but for them February the 23rd. That's because, remember, the old Russian calendar of the time was 13 days behind the modern calendar, which is also why the recent anniversary of the October Revolution actually took place in November. Now, the outbreak of the First World War had at first cut across the rising tide of opposition to Tsarist rule. But by 1917, with around 2 million Russian soldiers dead, that movement had returned with even greater strength. Indeed, the war was a key factor behind the rapid one-year time span of the 1917 revolution. That won't always be the case. The start of February saw a rising tide of strikes and protests against the Tsar's regime, because that regime was hated by the poor peasants who faced dire poverty in the countryside while their sons were dying in their millions in the trenches. It was hated by the workers who faced long hours, rocketing inflation, and now actual food shortages growing in Petrograd and other big cities. The Tsar's regime was even hated by the capitalist class. Not that some of them weren't making a tidy profit out of the war, but they resented being blocked from the political power that had been won by their class in countries like Britain and France. And while Russia as a whole was a poor peasant nation, with 80% of the working population still living on the land, in contrast, Petrograd and Moscow had a powerful working class, with thousands of workers employed in giant modern factories developed through British and French investors in particular, looking to profit from Russia's low-wage economy. Petrograd's industrial workers had a proud tradition of struggle, with Bolshevik Party members in February numbering around 2,000 in the city, playing a key role in their organisation. However, the Bolsheviks were without experienced leaders. Some had been sent as soldiers to the front, others arrested, and some, like Lenin, abroad in exile. So certainly, compared to other parties, like the Mensheviks and Social Revolutionaries, for example, those 2,000 or so Bolsheviks played an invaluable role on the ground, leading the factory meetings and demonstrations, speaking out in the barracks. However, there were no clear, authoritative Bolshevik leaders, and that meant that even the Bolsheviks lagged behind as events developed apace over the next 5 February days. As the tide of opposition had grown, Bolshevik activists had discussed whether it was time to call for a revolutionary general strike to topple the Tsar's regime. But they knew that if they did, there would be no turning back. They remembered how a previous attempt in 1905 had ended in bloody defeat, and they weren't confident that this time would be different. But while they debated tactics on International Women's Day, the women textile workers, enraged by the introduction of bread rationing, went on strike in any case. And at that point, the Bolsheviks knew they had to call on everyone to join them, as the worker Bolshevik leader Kornilov explains in the quote I've given you. And on that first day, about 90,000 workers went on strike. The police mainly held back. But on the next, the 24th, the numbers increased to 200,000 strikers, about half of the city's industrial workforce. Stones and ice were thrown at the hated police when they tried to attack the mass demos. But the soldiers were treated rather differently. Leaders like Kornilov engaged them in conversation to try to bring them over to the workers' side. And as I've quoted with the famous incident of the winking Cossack, it started to work. It was only on the next day, the 25th, that the Bolsheviks issued a leaflet calling for a general strike. But by then, actually, the strike was already general in any case. The 26th was a Sunday, so the factories were automatically closed, but tens of thousands still took to the streets, now facing state forces that had been given orders to shoot directly into the crowds. To overthrow the Tsar, the demand that the Bolsheviks really needed to be raising now was for an armed uprising, and an appeal to the soldiers was eventually drawn up on the 27th. But again, it was behind events, because by then
nearly all the troops had mutinied already. Because most of the peasant soldiers had no great love of the Tsar, no wish to fight the Germans, still less the Petrograd workers. They really just wanted to go home to their villages to live in peace. But unlike the workers, the soldiers couldn't hold demonstrations to judge the depth of opposition in the barracks. The soldiers had to wait for the moment when they could be sure of victory, certain that the workers were ready to fight to the end and that mutineers would never have to return to the retribution of their officers. And that moment had now been reached. The first regiments to mutiny rushed to neighbouring barracks to call them out too, like a flying picket might do, from factory to factory. The workers and soldiers linked up, agreeing a plan to disarm the police, free political prisoners, raid the arsenals and spread the mutiny. And by the nightfall of the 27th, they'd won. But over 1,400 workers were killed and wounded in the 5 days of the February Revolution. The regime had not disappeared without something of a struggle. Elsewhere, in Moscow, for example, strikes and demonstrations didn't start until the 27th, even later in other cities. But by then, there were no forces left anywhere willing to fight for the Tsar. And by March the 2nd, the Tsar had abdicated and a new provisional government had been declared. But this wasn't a government of the workers and soldiers who had carried out the revolution. It was a self-appointed handful of rich landlords and industrialists, with his careerist lawyer Kerensky as the only minister who could claim in any shape or form to be from the left, if you like. How could that happen? Because, as Trotsky puts it in his History of the Russian Revolution, the revolutionary leadership proved sufficient to guarantee the victory of the insurrection, but not adequate to transfer it immediately into the hands of the workers. Of course, this wasn't the first, and certainly not the last time, when a section of the ruling class has taken advantage of a revolution led by the masses to install themselves in power instead. It's just what happened in the Arab Spring of 2011 and Sudan in 2019. But while Sudan descended into a brutal civil war, Russia didn't, at least not until after the October Revolution. What was the difference? Revolutionary leadership, not least the return of Lenin to Russia in April. Because on April the 3rd, Lenin returned from Switzerland. Would the successful October Revolution have taken place if Lenin hadn't have done so? Probably not. Without his leadership, the opportunity would most likely have been lost. Because individuals matter. Otherwise, why struggle to educate revolutionary cadres, to build a revolutionary party? Now, that doesn't mean that we think that history requires individual geniuses to progress. No, as a science teacher, I know that Isaac Newton didn't suddenly think of gravity when he saw an apple drop from a tree. No, his scientific genius was just a summation of all the developing scientific thought of that time. Lenin's thought was similarly a summation of all of the lessons learned by the workers' movement up to 1917, of the ideas of Marx and Engels, of his own political education within the revolutionary movement over his lifetime. And his absence from Russia had left other Bolshevik leaders without the same experience to make serious errors. But before we talk about that, let's just return to February. Because when I said a new capitalist-led provisional government had taken power, some of you will be thinking, well, that's not the whole story. No, because the mass of workers rightly didn't trust these big business ministers. Instead, they looked to an alternative source of leadership, the Petrograd Soviet or Workers' Council. The idea of a Soviet had remained in workers' minds since the attempted revolution of 1905, when it had first been set up as a council of workers to organise a general strike, and Leon Trotsky had been its de facto leader. But while the delegates to the 1905 Petrograd Soviet had been elected in the heat of the struggle, the 1917 Soviet had only been set up after the days of the February Revolution had passed. So most of its initial delegates weren't those who had actively led the struggles in the factories and streets, but reflected the less revolutionary outlook of the broader masses. Amongst the workers, this meant that for now, most voted for the softer option of the Mensheviks rather than the Bolsheviks. Soldiers, usually from a peasant background, were also invited to send delegates. This had the great advantage of maintaining that bond between workers and soldiers that had been forged in the February days. But it also meant that they tended to vote for the peasant-based party of social revolutionaries at first. So a situation of dual power existed between the official provisional government and the unofficial Soviet. But actually, it was the Soviet that had the real power, because they were the ones that the workers and soldiers took instructions from, not the ministers. But the Menshevik and social revolutionary leaders who took control of the executive committee of the Soviet didn't actually want the power. They didn't want to challenge the capitalists over workers' demands, over ending the war, over giving land to the peasants. Instead, they passed their power back over to the capitalist ministers. And the Menshevik leaders gave a supposedly Marxist excuse for their betrayal. The February days, they explained, was the start of a bourgeois revolution to replace Tsarist feudalism with capitalism, and not a socialist revolution, which could happen perhaps sometime in the future after Russia had first developed its capitalist economy. Therefore, the Mensheviks said, they had to allow the capitalists to have the power. But those Russian capitalists, as Trotsky had long explained in his theory of permanent revolution, were far too entwined with the landlords to ever give land to the peasants, too tied to foreign investors to stop the war, too fearful of the workers to give them real freedom. So nothing was going to change, and nothing much did while the capitalists were in charge. The war ground on, and the conditions in the cities and countryside got ever worse. Although, it has to be said, by relying on their own strength and continuing their strike action, many workplaces won their demand for an 8-hour day. And, as Trotsky notes, that gave them vital time to organise and meet. Now, returning to the issue of the Bolshevik leadership, one of the first to return from exile was Joseph Stalin. He became the party representative on the Petrograd Soviet's executive, and also one of the editors of the Bolshevik paper Pravda. However, Stalin didn't challenge the Menshevik and social revolutionary excuses. He adapted to them instead. This is what Stalin had to say at a Bolshevik Party conference in April. The provisional government has taken the role of fortifier of the conquests of the revolutionary people. It is not to our advantage at present to force events, hastening the process of repelling the bourgeois layers. Now Lenin, in Zurich, reading what Pravda was printing, these kind of arguments, had grown increasingly alarmed. He wrote telegrams and letters raising his objections, the letters from afar, for example. But even then, only some of them were printed by Stalin and the editors of Pravda. Trotsky, in exile in New York, by the way, was writing very similar arguments to Lenin. Lenin knew he had to find a way back to Russia without delay, even though that meant negotiating to travel back through Germany, Russia's wartime opponent. Trotsky also boarded a ship to return, but was arrested by the British when it stopped in Canada, and that delayed him for over a month. But Lenin returned first, and immediately on doing so presented what are now known as his April Theses, actually to that same Bolshevik Party conference that Stalin had spoken at earlier. And in those debates, Lenin shifted the whole issue from one of finding theoretical excuses for not challenging bourgeois rule to organisational reasons why the proletariat, why the working class had not seized power in February. And again, Lenin said the reason is that the proletariat was not sufficiently organised. The material force was in the hands of the proletariat, but the bourgeoisie was conscious and ready. His theses called for no support for the provisional government, for a republic of Soviets, of workers, agricultural labourers and peasants' deputies. Lenin also explained, though, that as the Bolsheviks were for now a minority in those Soviets, then the Bolsheviks must patiently explain until, thanks to the experience of events, the masses change their view and give the Bolsheviks a majority. And by the time Trotsky was finally able to return to Russia on May the 4th, Lenin's position had already won overwhelming support amongst the Bolshevik Party ranks. After all, Bolshevism had been built in a fierce theoretical battle against the class collaborationist views of the Mensheviks. At last, thanks to Lenin, the worker Bolsheviks had someone who could tear down the theoretical excuses of Stalin and co. The decisive All-Russian Bolshevik conference held at the end of April gave overwhelming support to Lenin's position. The Bolshevik ship was now back on course, already now with 79,000 members nationally, and now in a position to rapidly build further support. By July, the pace of events had accelerated further. The Menshevik and social revolutionary leaders of the Soviet had taken what we might as well call a popular front position to its logical conclusion, accepting ministerial posts in a new coalition government alongside the capitalist parties. The Bolsheviks therefore raised the demand of down with the 10 minister capitalists. In other words, let's have a workers' government, not a coalition one. But that government had revealed its true nature by ordering soldiers onto the offensive at the front. But that offensive soon collapsed amidst retreats and desertions. The peasants were starting to seize the landlord's land without waiting any longer for the promised but continually postponed land reform legislation. New layers of workers have been taking strike action, like clerks and laundry workers. By June, the giant Putilov metalworks, a stronghold of the social revolutionaries in February, was now supporting the Bolsheviks. Between April and June, the Bolshevik Party doubled its membership in Petrograd to over 32,000. It didn't yet have an overall majority in the city Soviet, but it did amongst the workers' section of the delegates. So the rest of the country was catching up, but more slowly. They hadn't experienced the same level of struggle that the Petrograd workers and soldiers had been through. But that presented a problem. Yes, the Bolsheviks needed to base their demands on a correct calculation of consciousness. But consciousness can differ amongst different layers of the working class. And while consciousness in the country as a whole was still catching up, in Petrograd the workers were getting impatient, and the soldiers, who feared being sent to the front to die, even more so, as I quote from Trotsky. The mood of the Petrograd garrison was so determined that a successful insurrection probably could have been organised in the city right then in July. But Lenin and the other Bolshevik leaders tried to hold them back. Why? Because a premature insurrection would have resulted in defeat, with the government able to send in troops from outside Petrograd to crush it, just as has happened to the Paris Commune in 1871 and to the Moscow workers in 1905. But the soldiers hadn't made those tactical calculations. So on July the 3rd, they marched out of their barracks nevertheless, demanding the workers joined them. And Trotsky admits that many rank-and-file Bolsheviks were actually secretly pleased at the prospect of action, and that the official party policy of patience was being bypassed. A massive armed demonstration of hundreds of thousands soon filled the streets, demanding all power to the Soviets. Again, the Bolshevik leaders knew it was no use trying to hold back the movement any longer. But neither could they allow some kind of unplanned semi-insurrection to end in bloody disaster. So instead, a motion was successfully put to the Petrograd Soviet in the names of Kamenev and Trotsky to elect a commission to lead the movement. Because the Bolsheviks knew they had to give a lead, not so much to score a victory, but above all to avoid a defeat. Because already, as they had feared, the government had found the few armed officers willing to fire on the demonstrators. Of course, that just provoked even bigger demonstrations on July the 4th. But the Bolsheviks acted decisively, making sure the workers came out in force as well. 500,000 marched to demand the Soviet leaders took the power. But of course, those Menshevik and social revolutionary leaders made clear to the workers and soldiers that they had absolutely no intention of doing so. But thanks to having put themselves at the head of the movement, the Bolsheviks were now able to persuade the demonstrators to stand down. The impatient soldiers and workers were beginning to understand. It wasn't enough to call for the Soviets to take power if the Soviet leaders weren't prepared to do so. But this was inevitably also combined with disappointment and demoralisation that the July days hadn't led to the easy victory that some had imagined. And the Soviet leaders took their chance to go on the offensive, launching what Trotsky describes as the month of the great slander. And we know against Corbyn, the slander was of course anti-Semitism. Against the Bolsheviks in 1917, it was that Lenin was a German spy. Soldiers smashed up the Bolsheviks' printing press. Lenin was forced into hiding. Trotsky and others were arrested on charges of working with the aid of foreign governments. Anyone suspected of being a Bolshevik risked being beaten up by right-wing gangs. The reactionary general Kornilov was made commander-in-chief of the army, and the death penalty for desertion was restored. Now, in spite of that repression, the planned 6th Congress of the Bolshevik Party, with 175 delegates now representing 177,000 members nationally, that went ahead at the end of July, concealed in 2 different workers' districts. It was actually the Congress where Trotsky officially joined the Bolsheviks and was elected straight onto their Central Committee, although, of course, he was still in prison. And that Congress withdrew the central slogan of the previous period, the slogan of all power to the Soviets, because the July days made clear that this would only make sense when the Bolsheviks, who were willing to take the power, had become the new Soviet leadership. But they weren't there yet. In fact, for a few weeks, the Bolsheviks had to draw back and wait for that wave of reaction to exhaust itself. But by the end of the month, they'd regained their position in Petrograd's factories and could carry out open agitational work in the city again. By August the 12th, 400,000 workers took part in a massive one-day general strike in Moscow called by the Bolsheviks, with similar action in Kiev and other cities too. Consciousness across Russia was now beginning to catch up. The Bolsheviks' correct tactics had made sure the July days were only a setback, not a serious defeat. That massive August strike in Moscow had been called through the factory committees against the official opposition of the city Soviet, which still had a Menshevik social revolutionary majority in its leadership. The big city Soviets, still left in these reformists' hands, were beginning to become pointless talking shops rather than councils of actions. So much so that Lenin began to raise the idea that the factory committees were more likely to become the organs of struggle than the Soviets, because he was always flexible on tactics, and we need to be too. But actually the total number of Soviets was still growing. By the end of August, as the idea took hold of more rural counties and regions, there were over 600 across Russia, and the Bolsheviks were beginning to win more majorities in them too. Despite the attempted slander and persecution, the Bolsheviks were now growing swiftly again. And now, just as the Petrograd workers and soldiers had got impatient with the lack of change in July, some of the big capitalists and landlords were in August beginning to do so too. They wanted to know why Kerensky and the rest of the supposed radicals hadn't been kicked out of the government yet. They began to organise for a coup, with General Kornilov as their candidate for military dictator. The vain Kerensky had also been plotting with the generals, assuming he could persuade them that he would be a better candidate for dictator. But when, on August the 27th, Kornilov started to march his troops on Petrograd, Kerensky belatedly realised it wouldn't just be the Bolshevik leaders who might face the firing squad, so would he. So, from baiting the Bolsheviks in July, Kerensky was forced in August to turn to them for support. How did Lenin and Trotsky respond? They could easily have told the treacherous Kerensky exactly where to go. Instead, they adopted what we might now call the tactic of the United Front, agreeing to fight together alongside the ranks of the Mensheviks and social revolutionaries to defeat the coup, whilst demanding their right to continue to criticise their leaders and demanding they defeat the reaction in a genuinely revolutionary way, by demanding the arming of the Petrograd workers, legalising the transfer of land to the peasants, the introduction of workers' control in the factories, and so on. That way, there could both be unity and action against the common enemy, but the Bolsheviks could also draw the best activists from other parties towards them from the experience of common struggle. And you can see the quotes that Lenin and Trotsky are both in agreement over this double-edged Bolshevik policy. Now, unlike Kerensky, the Bolsheviks had already seen what was coming and made preparations in advance. They'd organised brigades of workers' militia through the district Soviets, who now, given a renewed purpose, became hives of activity once again. Powers to deploy troops in the name of the provisional government were given to a separate military revolutionary committee, where, although the Bolsheviks were officially in a minority, they effectively took command. The print workers and telegraph workers organised to block Kornilov's communications, while making sure the Military Revolutionary Committee, soon under Trotsky's leadership, had all the resources that they needed. The rail workers sabotaged Kornilov's troop trains, sending them off down the wrong tracks. Revolutionary agitators fraternised with Kornilov's men, often winning them over. Because the leaders of the insurrection had totally misjudged the strength of support for the revolution. In a few days it had disintegrated, and Kornilov was under arrest, sadly only to later escape and become one of the leading counter-revolutionary generals in the later Civil War. As for the workers, soldiers and peasants, those who'd attacked the Bolsheviks after the July days now realised they'd been duped. The slanders had been a preparation to launch a coup to crush the revolution. Not for the first or last time in history, the whip of the counter-revolution had driven events to the left, the opposite of what reaction had planned, and the tactic of the United Front had proved successful. After the defeat of the coup, support for the Bolsheviks had surged forward, both in membership and in winning majority support in many of the key Soviets. By October, they had 240,000 members nationally, leading over 20 million people, represented by the Soviets and factory committees. They had won a clear majority on the key executive committee of the Petrograd Soviet, with Trotsky, released from prison, elected its president. Now they were in a position to again demand all power to the Soviets, as now they were Bolshevik Soviets. And this was a demand that now matched the mood of millions of workers. The Bolsheviks had mobilised to call for a new Congress of Soviets to be convened, finally set for the 25th of October, a Congress that could, and did, formally then take power. But you can't overthrow capitalism just through winning a vote for a change in government, even in a Soviet. The new workers' regime also needs to take physical control of the state institutions, and that requires mobilising physical forces to take them over. And they'll need to be armed and ready to oppose any resistance that the defeated capitalists may still be able to call on. And that's what took place in Petrograd during the October Revolution of October the 24th and 25th in the old calendar. And in the brief time I've got left, I'm not going to say too much about the details of those events. Again, read about them in the relevant chapters of Trotsky's History of the Russian Revolution if you can. Suffice to say that just one, unlike February and July, there was hardly a shot fired in anger. The Petrograd garrison was already won over and taking its orders from Trotsky and the Military Revolutionary Committee. The few reactionary officers left were too demoralised to put up much of a fight. And two, the workers' militias and the most reliable naval and army units had enacted a carefully prepared plan to take charge of the key bridges, the telephone exchanges, the power and railway stations, arms and food depots, printing plants and so on. Although not quite everything went perfectly to plan, particularly when it came to capturing the Winter Palace, really the only scene of any combat. Although things did drag out, needlessly really, for much longer in Moscow, for example. But even then, before the October Revolution took place, there was one last critical debate to be had within the Bolshevik Central Committee. When was the right moment for that insurrection? There were some, like Zinoviev and Kamenev, that were still calling for caution, arguing the time was still not right for the Soviets to take power in their hands. Lenin, still in hiding after July, was suddenly faced with a rerun of April, trying to redirect a Central Committee that he feared was paying too much attention to the arguments of the Mensheviks and social revolutionary leaders, and not enough to the revolutionary mood of the workers and soldiers themselves. He wrote angrily at the way that Pravda, again under Stalin's editorship, was delaying or leaving out key passages from his articles. He even threatened to resign from that CC so that he could take his arguments to the party ranks, which to some extent he did in any case. And by the way, it was now, in August and September, that he wrote his pamphlet State and Revolution, not as some academic exercise, but as a preparation for October. Lenin realised the danger now wasn't in acting too soon, as it had been in July, but in waiting for too long. Even the peasants were now in revolt in the countryside and coming over to the side of the Bolsheviks. Any delay risked allowing frustration to undermine the mass support that they'd built up. And again, see the quote. A secret CC meeting was organised on October the 10th in a Petrograd apartment which Lenin himself attended in a disguised wig. Lenin argued his case and warned that staking everything on a prior vote at the Congress of Soviets before any seizure of power was a huge risk. Loyal government troops might prevent that Congress from taking place. An armed insurrection needed to be organised first, said Lenin. Much to his relief, His resolution was won by 10 votes to 2, with only Zinoviev and Kamenev against. But it was Trotsky, more in tune with the mood of the soldiers than anyone else on the CC, through his work with the Military Revolutionary Committee, who came up with a tactic that would most securely win mass support for such an insurrection. His idea was to use that Military Revolutionary Committee as a way to plan it, but presenting it, as indeed in fact it was, as a defensive action to defend the revolution, not, as the Mensheviks would try to argue, as an attack against it. The MRC, with Trotsky now as its president, had developed strong links with the soldiers and sailors committees across Petrograd and in the Baltic Fleet. What's more, they and the workers' militia were now taking orders only from the MRC. So Trotsky proposed that rather than name an arbitrary date for an insurrection, it was best to use an attack from the government on the revolution as a reason to launch a movement to defend it. And the soldiers knew an attack was coming, because the government was openly discussing ordering the Petrograd regiments to the front, perhaps to introduce new forces to attack the Soviet Congress, as Lenin had feared. On the morning of October the 24th, the government issued such an order to bring reliable troops into the city, arrest Trotsky, and again attack the Bolshevik printing press. But this was the perfect opportunity for the MRC to put its plans in place. By the time the Congress of Soviets convened the next day, Petrograd was in the hands of the workers and soldiers. The energy and determination of the masses had achieved that revolution, because a revolution can only happen when they have built enough steam up, if you like. But they had only succeeded thanks to the guidance and leadership of the Bolshevik Party.